So which of these have actually harmed people? Well, the answer is they all have, but some more than others. So for example, hundreds of years ago it was common for doctors to bleed patients with the hope of making them better by evening them out, but in fact what it actually did is weaken them, and many of them died. The early side airbags were introduced to protect passengers in car accidents, but the bags opened so quickly that they themselves damaged passengers, particularly younger children. In America, a system was introduced where teenage boys that looked like they may end up going to prison were shown the realities of prison life with the hope of putting them off, but for reasons you don't really understand, those children ended up being more, not less likely to go to prison. My point is this: many times things are done to try and make people's lives better, but actually end up making them worse. And I think that's also true of Lady Gaga's statement telling you that you're all superstars. Now, to explain this, we've got to start off by taking one step back and saying there's always great interest in why some people do better than others. So for example, why is it that some children grow up to do well at school and as adults avoid problems of drug addiction and crime, while others have completely the opposite experience? This is something that's really important to know, because if we can understand why it is that some people do better than others, we can help everyone to have more successful lives. When researchers started looking into this, they found a big difference between those children that did well as opposed to those that didn't, was that those that did well felt much better about themselves. They had what's called higher self-esteem. And when this was found out, it was thought to be hugely important. It was thought that parents and teachers should try and boost a child's self-esteem by telling them that they were great. The idea was that children would feel better about themselves and then actually end up doing better. However, some of you may look at this and think, well, maybe they've got it the wrong way around. Maybe it's not that you feel good about yourself and then you do well. Maybe it's that you do well and then you feel good about yourself. So maybe it's not that, let's say, you feel good about yourself and then do well in an exam. Maybe you do well in an exam and that makes you feel good about yourself. To find out which one of these it was, an experiment was done where pupils that hadn't done very well in a course were split into two groups. And one of the groups was going to have their self-esteem boosted by basically once a week being told how wonderful they are, while the other group wasn't. And then when they had their exams in the next term, they were going to have their results compared to see who'd done better. And there was a big difference between the groups, but maybe not the difference you might have been hoping for. In fact, the pupils that had their self-esteem boosted by being told how wonderful they were did massively worse than those that hadn't. In fact, their grades dropped by about half. And I think that this shows that it's not that you feel good about yourself and then you do well. It's the other way around. It's that you do well at something and that helps you feel good about yourself. And if you think about it, this makes sense, because if you imagine that you're someone with no qualifications, no job, and you've got a drug or drink problem, you're unlikely to feel that you're that wonderful. Telling someone they're great may make them feel better, but the really damaging thing is they seem to do less well. After all, why would you strive to improve yourself if you're just so perfect the way you are? And this is why I think Lady Gaga's statement and others like it telling you how wonderful you are, while well-meaning, actually causes real harm and is not something you should listen to. Well, so far so depressing, but we haven't actually answered the question of why it is that some people do better than others. And in truth, the answer to this question is really very complicated, but at least part of the answer was found in a study which is now one of the most famous ever done. In this study, groups of 3- and 4-year-olds were put in a room with a marshmallow and were told that they could eat the marshmallow whenever they wanted. But the researchers said that they'd be back in 10 minutes. And if the marshmallow was still there, they'd get 2. Now, some children ate the marshmallow and some didn't. But what they were doing is they were measuring those children's willpower. Did those children have the ability to hold off what they wanted right then, which is to eat the marshmallow, because they knew they could get something better in the future? What the researchers then did is they then followed those children into adulthood to see the difference between the children that had eaten the marshmallow and those that hadn't. They were really asking the question, does willpower make a difference to your life? And what they found out was that it does. They found that those people with higher willpower did much better at school, they were more popular with friends, and they were much less likely to have problems with drugs and drink. Well, this got researchers interested in the importance of willpower, and then a bigger study was done following 1,000 children right up into their 30s. And what they found about willpower was extraordinary, that those with higher willpower not only had fewer problems with drugs and alcohol, were less likely to get into trouble with the law, they had fewer STDs, they had better physical health, they made more money, they saved more money, they had better mental health, and they're in happy relationships. Well, I think the message from this is clear. I think it's saying that if you want the most successful life possible, don't listen to people like Lady Gaga telling you you're wonderful. What you need is willpower. Okay, so you may think, well, so what? Maybe it's all very interesting to know that willpower is important, but maybe it's not very useful, because maybe willpower is something you have, or you just don't have, just like the way you inherit the colour of your eyes. Well, in fact, that's not true. And our aim now is to really understand and examine willpower, to learn how it works, to learn how you can increase your willpower and how you can make the most out of the willpower that you've got. and by doing that to help you have the most successful lives possible. We're going to start off by explaining how willpower works, and it probably helps to think of willpower as being a bit like a muscle that gets tired with use. And this explains a study that was done where a group of hungry people were put in a room with a bowl of radishes and a bowl of M&Ms, and half the group were told you can eat whatever you want, and many of them, being hungry, ate some of the M&Ms, but the other half were told no, you can only eat the radishes. And while they wanted to eat the M&Ms, they used their willpower to resist doing so. And then the willpower of the two groups was compared, and this was done by giving them a possibly difficult puzzle to solve and seeing how long they spent doing it. And the group that ate the radishes only spent half the amount of time on the puzzle that those that had the M&Ms. Now some of you may think, well, what's happening here is the people that had the M&Ms have got more energy, and that's why they spent longer on the puzzle. But that's not true, because a control group was used. They were given nothing to eat, and they spent just as much time solving the puzzle as the M&M eaters. What in fact happened is the people that had ate the radishes had used up their willpower early on, resisting the M&Ms, and that means they had less to work with on the puzzle. So you can think of your willpower a bit like maybe like your arm muscle, that when you use it, it gets tired. But in other respects, your willpower is not really like your arm muscle, because if you use your arm muscles a lot, your leg muscles don't really get tired. But that's not really true of willpower. The difference with willpower is there's only one source of willpower, and it gets reduced for anything you require of it. So for example, whether it's resisting eating M&Ms, or making yourself do a difficult puzzle, or stopping yourself losing your temper with someone that's annoying you. You've only got one source of willpower, and that supplies everything you do. And that explains why university students, when they come up to their exams, have slight changes in their behaviour. So for example, around their exam time, all their willpower is going to dealing with their exams, and that means they've got less for all the other things that require some willpower. And that's why around that time those students tend to exercise less. It's also why they find it more difficult to resist caffeine, drink more tea or coffee, and they eat more junk food. Similarly, they tend not to return phone calls so much. They tend not to do the washing up. Their bedrooms get messier. Their personal hygiene suffers and they wash less. In fact, they're even more likely to go on shopping sprees. Okay, it may be obvious that something like exams would reduce your willpower, and also resisting tempting food would have the same effect, as we're trying to keep you calm when you really feel like losing your temper. Well, is there anything else that uses up your willpower? Maybe something that you wouldn't expect? Well, it turns out that actually making decisions does. And this explains a study where a group of people were asked to look at different computers and basically say the good and the bad things about them. And then they had their willpower tested afterwards, and basically it made very little difference. But another similar group were asked to do the same thing, but this time actually make a decision about which computer they think would be best for them. And when they had their willpower tested, it'd been reduced a lot. Okay, so you know willpower is important, and you know it gets used up with use, but how do you spot when you're running low of it? Because it's not really that obvious. So when your willpower is running low, you don't feel tired, you don't feel angry, you don't feel depressed. What in fact you feel is more extreme emotional reactions to events. So for example, things that might make you feel a little bit sad make you feel very sad, and things that might make you feel normally a bit happy make you feel very happy. If you've ever had a situation where you found yourself crying in a sad film where it's not the sort of thing you'd normally do, that's because your willpower is running low. Well, so what? How's this of any use? Well, I think it's useful because you can think of your willpower in the same way that you might think of your physical energy. So for example, if you had a big football match one day, you wouldn't go for a run in the morning, you'd rest up. And in a similar way, if you've got, let's say, a difficult conversation to have, or a big decision to make, it's probably not a good idea to do that when your willpower is running low after a long day at school. It's probably much better to wait to the weekend when your willpower is renewed. It also teaches you not to overload your willpower. So for example, let's say you've got 4 changes you want to make. So you want to work harder on your schoolwork, you want to get on with your parents who you might be finding annoying, you want to exercise more regularly, and you want to eat more healthy food. But if you decide to try and make all these changes in one go, the chances are almost certain that you're going to fail because you're asking too much of your willpower. What's much more sensible is to try and make one change at a time, and it's probably best to start off with eating more healthily, but we'll talk more about this later. So you know that willpower is important, and you know how it works, a bit like a muscle, and that it gets tired with use. But is there any way of increasing your willpower over time, particularly throughout a long day? And it turns out that there is, and it's to do with this chemical glucose, which your body uses for its energy, including your body's brain, which actually uses up 20% of your body's energy. And when you exercise your willpower, you use up glucose, and without enough glucose, you're going to have low levels of willpower. And this explains a study where people were given an impossibly difficult computer game to play, and those with lower levels of glucose got much angrier than those with higher levels. This also explains why women during a certain stage of their reproductive cycle have a slight change in their personalities. And that's because energy is being diverted from the rest of their body towards their reproductive organs, which means there's less glucose available for their brain. And this is why women during this time tend to have more mood swings. They're also more likely to smoke more if they smoke, and if they drink, they're also more likely to drink more. They're also likely to be more violent, as well as go on shopping sprees. Now, a couple of words of caution about this. The first thing to say is most women deal with this absolutely fine. And the second thing to say is that if anyone tries to argue that women are some way inferior to men because of this, it's worth pointing out that it's generally men, not women, that have particular problems with their willpower, especially regarding drug use and violence. So we know that glucose has got a really important role to play in keeping our willpower high, but how can we use this to increase our willpower throughout the day? Well, the obvious thing to do is to eat sugar, because I'm sure many of you know glucose is another name for sugar. But actually eating sugar doesn't really work well at all, because eating sugar is a bit like having a fire that's made of paper, and you get flames straight away, but very soon you're left with nothing, and when that happens, your willpower can completely crash. What's much more sensible to do is to eat things that are particularly high in protein, things like eggs, nuts or meats, and what happens then is your body converts those proteins to glucose throughout the day, giving you a constant supply. And that's much more like having a fire that's made from wood, that burns hour after hour after hour, keeping your willpower high throughout the day. And this is why it's so important to have a healthy breakfast. And by healthy breakfast I mean something that's particularly got protein in, something like peanut butter on toast or eggs with toast, not a sugary breakfast cereal. And in fact, really interesting studies have been done showing that if you can get pupils to have a decent breakfast, they learn more at school and misbehave less. And I can understand a lot of you thinking, well, this can't really be that important, because if it was that important, my parents wouldn't let me have sugary breakfast cereals, or maybe allow me to have no breakfast at all. And if it was that important, schools would maybe have breakfast clubs and teachers would go on about it more, and the school would ban junk food. But the truth is that many adults don't even know about this. So you know that your brain needs enough glucose in order to be able to keep your willpower high, but it also needs to be able to process and use that glucose properly. And to do this, your brain needs enough sleep. Now most of you are getting about 7 hours, which isn't enough. You need much more like 9. Now there's many reasons why it's important for you to get enough sleep, and this is only one of them. But if I was going to give you 2 bits of advice, the first one would be to stay away from bright lights at least 2 hours before bed, particularly your mobile phones. Now ideally you'd turn them off completely, but at the very least just turn the brightness right down. The second thing you should do is stay away from so-called energy drinks that are high in caffeine, particularly after 3 o'clock. Because if you don't, your body will still have enough caffeine in it that will stop you going to sleep in time. So now we know that willpower is important. We know how it works in a bit like a muscle and it gets used up over time. We know how to spot when you're running low on it, that you have more extreme emotional reactions. We also know how to increase it by making sure you eat properly and get enough sleep. And now we're going to look at how to make the most of the willpower that you've got. I'm going to start off by looking at how some people seem to nearly do everything right, while other people don't. And the obvious answer is the people that do everything right must be using their willpower the whole time to make themselves do the right thing, while the people that don't do the right thing don't use their willpower so much. But in fact that's not true. It's almost the opposite. In fact, people that do nearly everything right use their willpower less than the average person. But how's this? Well, the answer is that people that do everything right, or nearly everything right, use their willpower to build habits. Well, let's give an example of how this could happen by looking at previous example of, let's say, 4 changes you want to make. Well, if you try to do all of them at the same time, as I said, you're almost bound to fail because you're asking too much of your willpower. But if you decide you're going to start on one thing, let's say eating better, and initially you start off by using your willpower to change your diet. But over time that will become a habit, and once it becomes a habit you do it automatically, and you won't have to use your willpower to do that. And that will free up your willpower for the next change you want to make, and so on and so on. And it's through building successful habits that people manage to do nearly everything right. The second way you can make the most of your willpower is avoiding temptation rather than using up your willpower to resist it. And I'll give an example to explain. So let's say there's a man who likes to have a cold beer in the evening, or often in fact more than one, but he knows it's not good for him, and for that reason he never drinks during the week and hardly ever at the weekend. But what's impressive is he does this without using hardly any willpower at all. And how does he do this? He does it simply by not having any alcohol in the house. If he wants a beer, he has to go to the shop and buy one, and he'll only buy what he intends to drink that day. He'd never buy a case of alcohol because he knows he'd just drink it. You do the same thing with alcohol that you can do with chocolate. Now, I know that many of you hopefully aren't resisting drinking beers in the evening, but I do know that many of you struggle to do your homework as best you can because you're distracted by your phones. But in fact, using up your willpower to resist looking at your phones is a waste of your willpower. What you should do is avoid your phones entirely during that time. So turn them off when you're doing your homework, or even consider putting them in another room. A final way of making the most of your willpower is to try and think about things in the long rather than the short term. So for example, let's say you've got some homework to do and you think about it purely in the short term. You need to do your homework to avoid getting detention. Well, you're doing your homework, but it'll be shoddy. It really won't be very good. However, if you think about your homework in the long term, well, you need to do your homework, let's say, for good education, because good education gives you choices in the future about the jobs you're going to have. It'll help you support the family that you're going to have, and maybe be a better role model for your children. Well, you think about your homework in the long term like that, your homework will in all probability be excellent. So what have we learned? We've learned that if you want the most successful life possible, you need to focus on your willpower and not to listen to people like Lady Gaga telling you that you're a superstar. We've learned how willpower works, a bit like a muscle, in that it gets worn out over time, and how to spot when you're running low on willpower by them having more extreme emotional reactions to things. We've learned how to increase your willpower by making sure that you eat properly, particularly healthy breakfast, and have enough sleep, about 9 hours. And we've also learned 3 ways to make the most out of the willpower that you've got, by using willpower to build habits, by not wasting willpower by resisting temptation when you can avoid it, and also by thinking about things in the long term. If you'd like to know anything more about willpower, I can't recommend this book highly enough. This talk was almost entirely based on it, and it's a brilliant book that's both easy to read and accessible while still containing a huge amount of information. Unfortunately, some of it I wasn't able to squeeze into the limited time I had for this talk. Thank you very much for listening.